Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I know you'd probably rather be out in the drizzly rain. No, actually, we're thinking if this had been last week with the sun and the fallish weather, we might not have got so many people. So we're pleased to see all of you on the webinar today. This is the second in our series from this fall. We ran one a couple weeks ago, and this is the second one that we wanted to get in right before the presidential election. I'm pumped for the discussion today. Not only because we did a preview call the other day and went over kind of the flow of the conversation, but I representing the World Trade Center Buffalo Niagara have been watching the national rhetoric on the presidential campaigns, the debates, all the different information and insights coming out, and I'm sitting through each debate waiting to hear the question on trade policy. They have not come in any of the debates so far. We in the very first debate, when the two candidates were talking over each other, they talked about China a little bit, I think, but other than that, we really have not talked about trade in the debate. So as we were setting this up, we said let's take the bull by the horns and we'll talk about trade ourselves and get the information out to our stakeholders who care about it. So we appreciate the three speakers we have today. Doug Kennedy is the RBC Managing Director at the Center for Global Enterprise, the Schulich School of Business with York University. Jack O'Donnell, who's with O'Donnell Associates, and Chelsea Penrod Hickman, who's with Winning Strategies Washington. We've very thrilled that all of you offered your time and expertise to this conversation, and we're looking forward to digging in. Let me, as far as, we'll get right into it, but as far as ground rules for or housekeeping for the conversation today, we don't, for these webinars, wait till the end for Q&A. So if you have a question throughout the program, go ahead and type it in the chat box. You can do it one of two ways. There's a little button there that says everyone, or you can send it to me privately if you don't necessarily want your name attached to the question. We understand. We'll work it right into the conversation instead of waiting for the end. So plan on going about an hour and 15 minutes today. And we're looking forward to the dialogue and to seeing what your questions are and to hearing from our panelists. So thank you again for being here. With that, what I'd like to do is actually just give our panelists 90 seconds, 2 minutes to introduce yourself and lay a little context for why we invited you to this conversation. And maybe let's go ladies first. Chelsea.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation. I am based in Washington, D.C., and I've been working in and around the federal government for about 20 years now. I originally came to Washington like a lot of people do and thought that I would stay for a year and then go and do something else, but here I still am. So I spent 10 years on Capitol Hill in both the House and the Senate. And I'm now a partner at Winning Strategies Washington, which is a boutique lobbying firm, like I said, based in DC, and we have a wide array of clients, everything from higher education to healthcare, defense, you name it, we work on the issue. And trade has become an issue for almost every client that we work with, whether it's a pharmaceutical importer, whether it's an education institution that has interest in visas or other issues like that, or even just some of our companies that are trying to buy and sell goods. Trade has become a top priority for a number of our clients, and so I wouldn't have expected that it would affect quite so many, but that's why I'm here today, is to kind of talk about what I've worked on and what I've seen, and how I see that going forward. So I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
Thanks, Chelsea. Thanks for being here. Jack, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Jack O'Donnell. I'm the managing partner at O'Donnell and Associates. We're a New York-based government affairs lobbying firm. Like Winning Strategies, we represent people across the board: Fortune 500 companies, small nonprofits, kind of everyone in between. We've done a fair amount of work around trade. We do represent the Niagara Falls Bridge Commission, so we've been very involved there. And in the past, we did some work for the province of Ontario and the province of Quebec around some Buy New York provisions in New York State. I'm very familiar with all how important trade is to upstate New York, to all of New York, to Southern Ontario, and the work that the World Trade Center does, and excited to be part of this conversation.
Thanks, Jack. We appreciate you being here. And Douglas, we're thrilled to have you here to, especially having sat with you, before the webinar started to kind of hear your thoughts on some things. So appreciate you bringing taking on the Canadian point of view all by yourself. And if you could let us know a little bit about you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to work with Craig and his team at the World Trade Center Buffalo Niagara, and I appreciate everybody sharing their time with us this afternoon. I am the managing director of the Center for Global Enterprise. We are a combination think tank policy group based at the University of York University. Our mandate is very simply to enable Canadian companies to reach their full potential through engagement with international markets. We have a thought leadership side with the Schulich Business School academics. We research issues in international trade, international business, big picture, demographics, finance, and so on. Then there's the other side where we get involved with the policy side, both the provincial level, local level, and federal level, to support them and try and inform their decision making. We also run programs or vet programs, both in terms of grant applications as well as executive education and education in the business school area. We are a non-for-profit and supported by both the public sector, the Canadian federal government, as well as the private sector, which is why RBC is tagged to my name. That's one of the Canadian banks here. And I'm pleased to get involved.
Thanks so much, Doug. Let me start, and Jack, maybe I could start with you before we dig into the candidates' platforms and where they stand on the various trade issues that we care about. Let's talk about what I referenced in my intro, which is trade has taken a kind of a backseat to a number of, let's say, more sensational issues that are out there right now. What do you think is the significance of that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Craig. And I think you framed it well, right? Everything in some ways has taken a backseat to the coronavirus and the response and the impact on the community. But I do think sort of underlying those conversations, there's a fair amount going on around the trade conversation, right? I think that's much less in a state like New York, who we have a pretty good idea who New York's electoral votes are going to go to. But when you talk to folks in Ohio, especially in Michigan, I do think they're seeing a lot more sort of targeted trade rhetoric and a bit of a trade conversation, right? We also saw the first presidential debate. It's if it can be called that, I'm not sure that there are really any policy issues that are being talked about substantively. But I do think, it underlies, especially a lot of the rhetoric that the president is using, right? He talks about, he talked yesterday about dishwashers. He talked about manufacturing and sort of what that means. And so I do think he's kind of leaning into it. And we've certainly seen in Washington, as the conversations around the stimulus go, there've been really a lot of push, especially on the Republican side, to make sure that there's some subsidies for farmers in some of these states that have been hurt by some of the trade. Maybe Chelsea could tell us more about that too.
Chelsea, let's go with Chelsea. What is the significance of the lack of dialogue on trade right now?
Sure. And I appreciate Ashika's not, if she doesn't mute me. I know that that's something, if we get into it too hot, that we'll get muted. But I think to Jack's point, I agree with everything Jack said. And the other point that I would make is trade hasn't been its own separate issue because it's so connected to a lot of the other issues that are kind of the hot topics of the day. So for example, one of Joe Biden's big platforms is labor, and how are labor rates going to be affected. He wants to have a cabinet level working group focused specifically on labor. And that has huge implications for trade. How is that going to affect what, the United States brings in, what it doesn't? And for what Jack said about the subsidies, I think we're really grappling in Washington with the fallout of the aggressive use of the Section 301 and 232 tariffs in terms of, the cost and the impact on American companies. But it's also a little bit strange when you look at USMCA and some of the other things that are going on and putting in place tariffs on our neighbors, right? On our neighbors and allies. Steel tariffs are kind of an on again, off again thing with our friends in Canada. And so I think the economic impact of that has been significant. And I think that a lot of the discussion about, whether it's aid to farmers, whether it's, retraining for workers, that's really code for how are we going to deal with trade and what do we anticipate going forward.
Thanks, Chelsea. And Doug, Chelsea mentioned the tariffs, and obviously Canadian companies are watching the election very closely because a lot of what's happened over the past 4 years has been directly associated with the policies of President Trump. So are you getting the information that you need on trade? Do you know what's coming?
Well, and again, I'm speaking for myself. I don't reflect any official view. But the big thing is that we don't really differentiate too much. We look at the trade policies of either party. And while there's differences in emphasis on energy trade, for example, we expect that USMCA will form the basis, the rules basis, but there's always going to be frictions and things that come up. And we are prepared for that. The difference, I think, between Canada and the United States is that trade is about 1/3 of the Canadian GDP in terms of scale. It's about 26% in the States. United States top 3 trading partners all account for 13 to 14% of their international trade. Canada, it's about 75%, 70 to 75% of the States, which means that how this election goes is going to have an impact on about 20% of the Canadian economy. So obviously we're paying very, very close attention to what's going on south of the border.
So Chelsea, let me start with you. There shouldn't be too much guessing in how either the candidates will move forward. We had 8 years with Vice President Biden and the Obama administration. We've had 4 years with President Trump. Do you think we can get a good sense of what's upcoming based on what we've seen the last 12 years?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot that we can learn, but there have been a couple of, I think, significant changes, one of which is the coronavirus pandemic and the umbrella that creates for all kinds of policy making that may or may not be directly related. And one of the things that you're seeing out of this is a real focus on Buy American. The president has issued an executive order on Buy American related to pharmaceuticals and key ingredients, PPE, that sort of thing. So that was a policy goal, I think, that existed for the president before, but he's using kind of the auspices of the coronavirus to say, look, this is the time to do it. So I think that you're going to see a lot of opportunities, that arise because of that to advance those priorities. And I think it's not insignificant to say, Ambassador Lighthizer, the current U.S. Trade Representative in the United States, he has upended trade policy pretty significantly in the United States. He's a smart guy, and he is very convinced that what he's doing is the right thing, and the president listens to him. And so when you look at these, Section 301 investigations or 232 or what USMCA, whatever it is, he has very specific America-centric goals and views, and there's a level of isolationism that comes with that. I think on the Biden side, there's probably less difference between the two than you might think. Vice President Biden has, again, interest in U.S. steelworkers and labor, and there's a lot to be said for this. Buy American. There's a lot of worry. Oh no, what if India shuts down? What if China cuts off our supply of this? But what gets caught up in that is all of our other trade partners too. So it's not just the big bad China or India. It's, well, we shouldn't be buying anything from anywhere. And that's, I think, the balance that you're going to have to strike. And I don't think necessarily that's been done successfully by the Trump administration, but how a Biden administration would balance that, I'd be interested in Jack's view. But I think that's a challenge that they're going to have to face that they didn't have in place before.
And Jack, what do you think we can take from the last 12 years?
Yeah, I think Chelsea nailed some of it on the head, but I think while you're going to see Joe Biden in some ways continue a lot of what the Obama administration did, Chelsea talked about one of the biggest things that changed, and this was also, I think, a significant difference between how Joe Biden sees himself and how Barack Obama saw himself, which is Joe Biden sees himself as blue-collar Joe. And I think the 2016 election results also dictated, that the Democratic Party in 2018 and now in 2020 is a lot more focused on, blue collar workers and sort of what that looks like, right? Chelsea mentioned steel workers, firemen, operating engineers, carpenter, all these folks. And sort of what that looks like. And, you saw in the Democratic National Committee's position on trade at the convention this year starts with, we're not doing anything that's not worker focused, right? So I think you'll see a little more of that. And I also think one of the things that, sort of underlies a lot of what Chelsea said is that I think on China, there may not be as much distance between these two candidates as there is on a lot of other things. But I think significantly, a potential Biden administration, one, would probably be a bit more thoughtful in its approach, right? They're going to want to have a process, and these people speak to it, and they'll have trial balloons and kind of work through it, as opposed to the president's negotiating stance and how quickly that can change. And then I think the other thing you're going to see a lot of, and this is what we saw, this will be the continuation of what the Obama administration did, but using trade and trade alliances as an opportunity to partner with our friends, our allies, to police the world and have some interconnectedness, right? And that was the underlying goal of TPP. But you're going to see more of that kind of collaborative approach.
And Doug, you've been watching two administrations in a row now and getting ready for what's next. What are you seeing that's a takeaway from the last 12 years that we can, let's say, count on for going forward?
I don't see, obviously the two parties have differences in terms of what they're looking to promote. So for example, to use a very simple example, Canada's largest export to the United States is mineral fuels, it's oil and gas. President Trump and his administration, very, very keen on supporting that, on fracking in the United States and so on. Whereas the Democratic Party, at least stated, are more Paris Accord, they might rejoin the Paris Accord, not quite as friendly to oil and gas. And obviously how that affects the US economy, how those things play out are going to affect trade by virtue of how the impact of the economy is. I think the one thing that we'll see, hopefully, is depending on the administration, I think it'll be less differences in terms of trade policy, but I think on the diplomatic side, how they approach trade policy could be different. With the continuation of the Republican regime, another 4 years of Trump, it'll be kind of what we're used to, overnight shocks by tweet. Aluminum tariffs are coming back in, thou shalt not deal with Huawei, and so on and so forth. Whereas I think under a Biden administration, I think there is a bit more multilateral approach. So I'm thinking that Paris Accord, rejoining that and working in a multilateral way, as opposed to the US standing on its own. CPTPP is what we refer to it now, but it's the old TPP that the US dropped out of. I could see an effort of going back into it because it is one of the ways that the markets that are involved, and there's a lot of Southeast Asian markets, a lot of South American markets that are part of that agreement, that will allow them to reduce their reliance or their vulnerability to the economy of China. And again, that's a long-term US interest. It's just that the Republican administration pursued it unilaterally. And I think that a Biden administration may be more inclined to work multilaterally.
Doug, let me come right back to you. We were talking about trade agreements. Let's talk a little bit about USMCA, which came into effect in the middle of COVID. Companies were not necessarily focused on it. They were focused on staying open and keeping their employees safe and figuring out what the future was going to look like. And now we've got this agreement in place. How USMCA will go, obviously it was President Trump's baby, so we kind of have an idea what it means to him going forward, although as Chelsea pointed out, there seems to be some sporadic, whims, I guess is the right word when it comes to tariffs and things. So, but with a Biden administration too, how is USMCA play into all of this?
I mean, the agreement we call New NAFTA up here is essentially it needed to be modified, okay? And where the modifications took place, all to the good. But the US administration tends to be driven by domestic politics. And it's the senior partner. The three countries, it's by far the largest economy, the senior partner. So that when it comes to aircraft or it comes to steel or it comes to wood or whatever, if there is an issue in an important political segment in the United States, NAFTA or no NAFTA, we have learned that it's going to come up. There's going to be friction. There's going to be issues that'll have to be resolved, hopefully within NAFTA, but if necessary, outside of NAFTA. That would be the probably the biggest point. I guess the other thing is that perhaps between the two administrations, that you'll have fewer of these midnight shocks. That would be, I think, be very, very important because obviously reliability and resilience of supply chains is extremely important. And to use a pandemic example, in the early days, there was a shortage of masks in the United States. Canadian government and health system had a contract with 3M and a couple of other suppliers for large shipments of masks. And overnight, the president just said, no, we're not going to export it. It's going to be used here domestically. We're going to take that over. Obviously causing an issue. We're supposed to be an ally. We're supposed to be extremely highly integrated. And the same with tariffs on steel and aluminum. Canada as a security threat to the United States. The only threat really there is to a segment of US industry where we're competitive. And it's interesting to note that at least in aluminum, the US industry is all foreign owned. There aren't any major US aluminum manufacturers anymore. So you're basically talking about transplant plants in the United States. So that certainty, that reliability on the diplomatic side, I think is something that we would definitely welcome.
Jack, your thoughts on USMCA in the midst of everything?
Yeah, I think Doug said a lot of it well. I mean, I will also, wearing the Democratic hat here, while the president gets or should get and deserves most of the credit for getting that deal done, right? Big parts of it were, those negotiations began under Obama and the Obama-Biden administration and as part of the TPP. But again, I think Doug hit it well that a lot of this is going to be driven by domestic politics. And I think, hopefully the new agreement provides some more stability. We do think underlying the presidential election, obviously, is the control of the U.S. Senate. We've heard from New York's own Senator Chuck Schumer about trying to, if they take the majority, rein in the ability of the president to declare those emergencies. and sort of unilaterally declare the tariffs and kind of rolling back that power. So I think that's sort of out there as a subtext here. But it'll be kind of interesting to see how that goes. And again, I'll just reiterate the Biden administration's commitment to workers and looking at that piece.
And Chelsea, let me give you a shot at USMCA too, and maybe because as Jack pointed out that President Trump's carrying the banner for it, but there was definitely a lot of input from both sides of the aisle in that final agreement. So I want to get your take on that, but maybe talk about how Mexico factors into it a little bit too, going into the upcoming election.
Yeah, it's one of the few bright spots of bipartisanship over the last 4 years. There was a lot of credit to be taken, and a lot of people reached up and took it, right? Everyone touted what they got, right? Oh, and we made the worker protection stronger. House Democrats talk about that, and House Republicans talk about, and look, we opened these new markets, and there's all these different people kind of taking credit for that. And it's an interesting kind of dynamic because, especially on the Republican side, NAFTA is kind of a bad word. And so when you're talking about NAFTA 2.0, so it's really striking that there is that this was a bipartisan effort and that both sides are taking credit. I think that's one thing I would look at. On the Mexico side, I think one of the things that the pandemic has made clear too is there is a saturation, if you will, in some of the places in Asia where a lot of the manufacturing and production and that sort of thing has been offshored. And one of the things that Republicans and Democrats are talking about is, well, wait a minute, what about Mexico? There's abundant labor, there's all these opportunities. And so I think Mexico has an opportunity here to really thrive if under the right circumstances. And one of the factors I think that's going to make a big difference is, Joe Biden served for decades on the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, and he sat as part of, all kinds of different negotiations and different things like that. He brings a completely different view to this than President Trump. He just does. And having that more worldview, who are our allies, who are our closest allies, that sort of thing, he thinks in those terms in a way that President Trump just doesn't. And so I would say, even though, agreed with everything that Jack said about, the workers, making sure that there are those protections and that sort of thing, I think he's also going to be really anxious to kind of reestablish our standing in not only in the hemisphere, in this part of the world, but across the country. And that's a place to start is, with these closest allies. So I would think under either a Biden or a Trump administration, there would be continued, how can I take credit for this? It just might be a little bit different.
Chelsea, let me stick with you. And I was going to ask something, and then we got a question in the chat along the same lines too. We talked about TPP briefly, but I want to get into TPP and other trade agreements, specifically multilateral trade agreements. Do you see a shift there? Again, I don't know that we've heard specifically. We know how President Trump feels. Where do you suppose that a Biden administration might end up on those?
I mean, I think again, just thinking of Biden's history, background, his interests, and the fact that he served for so long on that Foreign Affairs Committee, he considers himself a foreign affairs expert. And so I think his approach to that, the multilateral approach, just is more in keeping, I think, with who he sees himself as, right? And who he sees the United States, right? The United States is a leader, but not a dictator. And so I think the approach that we've seen with the Trump administration has been very America-centric, America's the best, and everybody, should be lucky enough to do business with us. Whereas I think a Biden administration would look at it a little bit more pragmatically. What can we gain from all these different pieces that exist out there? So I would imagine a more multilateral approach where it's possible. But you also have that factor that Jack mentioned with, is there going to be an effort to rein in the president's authority to negotiate? And are there going to be changes on that front that make it a little bit difficult for him to maybe be as expansive as he would like to be?
Doug, let me pitch the trade agreement question to you, because I learned recently, and we talked about it the other day, that Canada has more trade agreements than any country on the planet. But in USMCA, now there's some rules about the three partners' abilities to sign on to new trade agreements. How does that affect, I guess the question is, if President Trump, say Canada believes that he's misbehaving with the tariffs, what's the appetite for saying, okay, whether we're gonna trade with all these other partners that we have? What's the prospect?
Well, I mean, that's been a thread through the Canadian economy for a long time. Some of your viewers may not know it, but there is a ministry within the federal government with a cabinet minister representation, specifically looking at trade diversification. The government has a 1.5 million Canadian dollar program to encourage Canadian companies, one, to engage globally in general, but more specifically outside of North America. Again, simply because we have all our eggs traditionally in the one US basket. So it's a definite issue for us, but it gets back to the sort of the pattern of the economy. We supply about half of your total petroleum imports. The flip side, of course, is that the US is by far our biggest supplier of oil. It just happens to be geographically mixed. Central and west, we're exporting to you. On the East Coast, Quebec and over, it's US pipelines running north into Canada. You're not going to be able to change that. I think that for basic trade, the bigger question for us is how quickly the US is going to recover from the pandemic. How soon is demand going to come back? That's going to have the biggest short-term impact on Canadian trade with the United States. We tend to focus on goods, but the other important thing is services. The US runs traditionally a very, well, I guess in 2018, something in the region of a $35–36 billion surplus in service exports. Well, if Canadians can't travel down to Florida for their winters or go to Hawaii, that's going to be a real issue affecting trade. So I think the agreements are less important. And Canada doesn't have the most trade agreements in the world, but we are uniquely the only G7 member that has a free trade agreement with every other G7 member, excluding the UK once they drop out of the EU.
Jack, I don't want to leave TPP and trade agreements without giving you a shot at it. Do you have anything to add to those?
Yeah, I mean, I just echo my colleagues here, but I do think maybe we'll see less grand, grand agreements like TPP and more of the sort of individual diplomacy kind of agreements and trade trips and some of that stuff. And I do just want to pick up one of the other things that I'm watching that I think will be very interesting. He mentioned the UK. I was on a call this morning with the Irish new minister for Ireland's new minister for Diaspora, and he was talking about Joe Biden's longtime commitment to the Northern Ireland peace process and sort of where that fits into the whole Brexit and being willing to do a deal with the UK and sort of, again, you've got those contrasts. And it's going to be interesting to see how a potential Joe Biden administration works through them.
I want to get back to the Buy American piece, and maybe Chelsea, I'll start with you. We had a webinar 2 weeks ago, our 2021 economic forecast, and our economist, who's Mark Chandler that we work with from Bannockburn, talked about economic nationalism. which is interesting because he didn't talk about it just from the perspective of the US or Canada, but around the world, almost as if President Trump's economic nationalism has caused a trend around the world. So you watched the first debate, and one of the few points that did make it through was that Vice President Biden, when that conversation was on the table, almost outdid him on almost outdid the president on economic nationalism. So where is this leading, and how is the world's response to it affecting it?
Yeah. Who loves America more? That's right. That's the competition that they're having right now. It's a really interesting part of the kind of the fabric of this campaign, especially knowing that whether it's a second Trump administration or first Biden administration, the biggest issue on the table is going to be economic recovery. How do we now get to, whatever our post-COVID life looks like, or, whatever that is. And there is a lot of that Buy American rhetoric that I think is intended for those audiences who are really worried about jobs and is the unemployment rate going to go down? Am I going to be able to find a job? That sort of thing. So there's a real focus on Buy American from that perspective. But in reality, the pandemic has exposed some real challenges with the way that we buy and store goods. I talked earlier about the executive order on pharmaceuticals in particular, and over time that those key starting materials and the API and other things that go into the active pharmaceutical ingredients, they've just slowly gone, mostly to China and other places. But that doesn't come back overnight. And so I think that the Buy American kind of mantra is going to cost a lot of money to do it. And I think part of what the Trump administration has tried to put in place are huge government investments in making that happen, right? So is it going to be Biden one-ups and continues those investments, or turns a different direction? I think that President Trump has put a lot of money where his mouth is on actually making investments. But there's the question of, okay, how many of those are going to be sustainable in the long term, and what's really the impact going to be? And we thought we needed all these ventilators, but now we don't. And now what do we need? And so there's a little bit of that chaos. But I think this is another area where there's just not a ton of space between the two candidates. They have different reasons for wanting it, but I think they're pretty close on where it is. So I think it's going to, the election won't have as much of an impact on that, but again, the shift to economic recovery is really going to be where the rubber's going to hit the road on that.
Jack, your thoughts on the economic nationalism piece?
Yeah, I just want to add that I think I love America the most. I also think, that everything Chelsea said was absolutely right, and I also think on the campaign side of this and on the rhetoric, it's also what does that mean, right? What does Buy America mean to you? It means something different if you're in Ohio or Iowa or upstate New York, right? And so I think working through some of what those things are, but I've seen the polling, it's incredibly popular. But then if you tell people they have to pay a little more, or they're going to pay a lot more, right? There's some sticker shock. But all of this goes into whatever recovery looks like, when that happens. And I do think, Joe Biden's experience with the stimulus under Obama in 2009 and sort of what some of that looked like, I think they've been maybe not entirely frank, but I think that they've accepted that they missed some of this, right? And they missed some of the manufacturing and the impact on workers and, what some of those things look like. But I think it's here to stay.
And can I just add one thing to that? I think one of the inherent tensions that we're seeing is in the case of a Biden administration is some of the manufacturing and things that have left. A big part of that is environmental concerns, right? It's because we don't make it, or we can't get, approval for things. So that's going to be a real tension, I think, for Biden in particular, to kind of thread that needle between his very progressive wing that wants the Green New Deal and wants to have very aggressive caps put in place, whatever it is, and how do we do that and bring some of that manufacturing back, knowing that there might be that trade-off.
Sure. And Doug, on the economic nationalism piece, there's been, Canada has had its own, but some of it you could argue was forced. It was a tit for tat. We're going to do the tariffs on steel. Okay, well, we're going to put tariffs on motorcycles and things. So, how do you see it from here?
Well, economic nationalism is a problem. We are much more of a trading nation than the United States, simply given our scale. In terms of buy American or buy local, immediately short term, I don't think it has a huge impact on Canada, because if you look at what we actually sell to the United States, it's oil and gas. You can frack all you want, but you're still going to need to import. Second is vehicles, and the components and the assembly vehicles is so integrated in North America. Trying to rip out a larger US component of that, I think, is going to be a challenge. Our third biggest export to the United States is machinery and equipment, a lot of it being components and electronics, but that's 7%. So, unless that is involved with, that's affected by Buy American, and I don't think it may be at the margin, but in terms of having a real impact on the Canadian economy, it's not. And then as you go down the list into things like precious metals, into wood and lumber, into finished agricultural products and so on, I think less susceptible to that kind of pressures. But it does mean that for infrastructure projects, we do agreements, and actually the agreement that we have with the European Union allows them to bid on projects in Canada, because we have reciprocity to a higher degree than what the new NAFTA provides. So they will be more competitive in Canada than, say, a US firm might be. And the biggest thing within Canada is that, unlike the United States, is that there's a lot of provincial barriers. So before we start talking about buy Canadian, it's actually a lot of buy Quebec, buy BC, buy Alberta. We are much more fragmented in terms of our local economies than you are in the States. And so that's an issue that we're constantly playing with.
And we've talked about that with the Niagara wineries as well, as being able to I suppose export out of Ontario to other provinces. Yeah. I had a question come in on the chat that's kind of a niche question, so there's not pressure on you to answer. I just want to throw out to see if anybody can answer it. We wanted to discuss the 201 investigation on blueberries and other produce and how that can affect out-of-season supplies, which will have significant effect on Canada and Mexico. Is that a topic that any of you could weigh in on? No?
No expertise.
Not off the top of my head.
Okay.
Happy to.
All right.
I know what blueberries are. Does that help?
They're delicious. Yeah. So we can talk about that one offline, because I bet there's some folks on the call that could, or on the, in the audience here that could offer some expertise on that. So let me move on to my more prepared questions. I am not going to ask any of you to pontificate on what's going to happen with COVID. However, within 90 days, one of these two candidates are going to have to deal with whatever's on the table at the time. How do you see each candidate's approach to revitalizing the economy, digging into this record national debt, and and using trade to do it? Maybe Chelsea, you want to start on that?
Sure. I think that if you have a Biden administration, the record debt, one of the ways he deals with that is rolling back tax cuts. He's talked very specifically about Americans who make more than $400,000 a year are going to have their taxes raised, and just no bones about it. He's also talked about some of the corporate tax, the tax breaks that were put in place in 2017 under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and letting those expire There's a lot of talk about whether it's, depending on your audience, right? It's tax loopholes or it's special treatment or whatever. But I think there's going to be a lot of focus on using the tax code to encourage investment in the United States, but also there's not going to be, I don't think that there's going to be a lot of tax cuts. I think that's how that he'll approach it. If it was a second Trump administration, I think that there's more of the same. It's, we're going to continue to do whatever's necessary. We're going to keep taxes low because that generates jobs. I think that the real challenge is going to be the amount of debt is so staggering that it's almost hard to get your arms around it. And one of the challenges that either candidate is going to face is you have members of Congress, particularly on the Republican side, who will not vote for anything that spends more money because the debt is so high. So you automatically have this subset of Congress that is not going to be with you no matter what. That means on a stimulus, that means on just regular, defense spending, whatever the case may be. So the way that they're going to have to strike that balance, whether it's a Trump administration or a Biden administration, I don't think that we know what that looks like. I think it's going to be a very difficult kind of row to hoe. But I will say, I think if you have a Biden administration, I'd be interested, Jack, if you disagree, I think that there's going to be a big surge focus on economic recovery at the beginning. So I think there will be less concern about the debt in the immediate term and more on the kind of a surge kind of, approach. But then there's going to be that reckoning that comes with it.
Jack, you want to take that segue?
Yeah, I entirely agree. I think if Joe Biden is president, you're going to see that debt really pile up because, right, we can talk all we want about rescinding some of these tax breaks. And I did think, I don't know how many of you saw this morning, but the rapper 50 Cent said he's going to be 20 cent if Joe Biden's tax plan goes through. But I think you are going to see that spending, and I think you're going to see spending and investment in things like manufacturing, but a lot of infrastructure, a lot of buildings, a lot of as much of that as you can, as Chelsea said, is sort of a front-loaded stimulus here.
Especially if there's a Democrat Senate.
Good, right.
Yeah, you can pretty much double the number if it's a Democratic Senate.
And Doug, kind of same question, different perspective is watching what's obviously the Canadians have their views on what's happening in the U.S. with COVID, up to and including these border extensions, which as of yesterday go out another month, which other parts of the country don't see the same way as we do. But what are your thoughts, and what are you looking at on when it comes to COVID going into the next presidential administration?
That's a question I would be in a much better position to answer maybe a year or 2 years from now. Different governments around the world are taking different approaches. The US government has sort of leaned to the early reopening model to keep the economy sort of on a higher level. Other countries, Canada perhaps to some degree, has taken a more harsher approach. So, get the pain done and over with now. I'm not sure which is going to be successful, but to get to the point of the other panelists, regardless, both governments have really spent a lot of money, to keep the economy from completely cratering. That support is going to have to continue until such time as we actually get a sustained recovery. We have a slight advantage in Canada, is that we went into COVID with the lowest combined provincial and federal debt of all the GDP countries. So we had a little bit more wiggle room in terms of the money that we could spend. But again, if you're looking, continuing current policies a year, 2 years out, we're going to be up there, sort of in Japanese levels of national debt. I guess the other thing is the response that the American government takes to financing COVID will have a ripple effect here in Canada. So one of the things that hurt the Canadian economy in terms of attracting foreign investment, foreign companies coming in and using Canada as a base as opposed to the US, were the Trump tax cuts. Canada did not follow suit. And so from corporate taxation perspectives, Canada became relatively less attractive as an investment destination to set up a business, establish employment here, than the United States. To the extent that that's rolled back or partially rolled back, that's obviously going to make Canada more attractive. Individual taxation, I don't think makes a whole lot of difference, but it's really the corporate taxation and the policies that whatever administration comes in uses to revitalize the US economy. That's obviously going to have a major effect on us, both in terms of demand for the current products that we're doing, but also in terms of the attractiveness of Canada as a destination for foreign companies coming in.
Thanks, Doug. So we're coming up on the end of the hour, and I'm gonna start to wind down. If anybody has any other questions you want to pop into the chat, go ahead and do so. But I want to really thank all three of you for I'd say the courage for coming on and giving a public statement on this, because I can almost guarantee that while we were sitting here, something happened that changed what we were talking about.
Yeah, keep your Twitter feed open all the time.
Right. Yeah, don't watch Twitter while we're actually running the panel here. But I guess I'd like to close with asking each of you to kind of sum up your biggest takeaway from today, and maybe what do you think the trade community should be watching over the next couple of weeks leading up to Election Day? Maybe Jack, you want to start that?
Sure, absolutely. I think that the trade community is probably like the rest of us, and they really just need to hold their breath for the next 2 weeks. Or I'm more concerned that might be a couple weeks after that while we're counting votes. But I think you said it well. I think one of the important questions earlier was what can we expect, right? We have 4 years of President Donald Trump. We keep hearing 47 years of Joe Biden's public life to kind of look at, and so I think we know where both of these things will go. People have to make up their own minds, but a lot of us believe that having some certainty and having a process in place would be good for business, right? And knowing what to expect over the next year, 2 years, and having that move in sort of a rational way, and having that certainty, is a great opportunity for businesses.
Thanks, Jack. All right, I'm gonna break up the U.S. and Canadian perspectives here. Doug, you wanna take on that last thing? What are we watching over the next 2 weeks?
Again, when it comes to U.S. like Canada-U.S. trade policy and approaches, there are some differences sectorally, but in general, it's going to carry forward. The economies are integrated. That's going to carry forward. I think one thing that would be welcome on this side of the border is a little bit more reliability and a little bit more predictability as to what is going to happen tomorrow, what's going to happen a week from now, and how that's going to be impacted. But otherwise, I think the bigger issue is how we both handle COVID, how we get out of this, and then what kind of investments we're making in the economy post-COVID, because it's pretty clear that certain industries, cruise lines, travel, that sort of thing, are likely to be in a prolonged slump. Other industries, like including Zoom, who I wish I was a shareholder of, and the whole entire digital, as well as the working from home, is going to be very, very strong. I guess the ones, if we have to pick 2 sectors that we're looking at, the first would be oil. Depending which side gets in. In oil, global demand is down about 10%. Under a Biden administration and more green policies, that may come back slower. And as Canada is sort of the marginal producer and price taker, could have a very big impact on Alberta and Newfoundland, their provincial economies. And the second is just overall demand. We sell the bulk of our exports to the United States. If demand is healthy there, if it's rising there, Canadian companies are able to share in that.
Excellent. Thanks, Doug. And then Chelsea, we'll finish up with you. Your thoughts on what should we be watching up until Election Day and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, we've lived, I think just because of COVID, we've lived in a little bit of a, state of suspended animation for a lot of this year in a lot of different ways. And that suspended animation is going to continue, I think, for the next couple of weeks, barring some, huge surprise that we don't see coming. I think the thing that I'm watching is how quickly and in what way does either a second Trump administration or a first Biden administration shift kind of from COVID relief to recovery and resilience. There's a difference between, okay, we're just getting through what we're doing, trying to get through day to day, but then it's, okay, how do we recover, rebuild the economy? How do we protect against this? And I think that trade is absolutely just intimately tied into that. Whether it's, like Doug was talking about, is there going to be as much cross-border travel? Are folks from Toronto going to be trying to spend the winter in Florida in the future, or are they going to just completely change their habits? What does that actual recovery phase look like? And that's where, we'll be watching for our clients. Are those patterns that they planned their business around, are those patterns forever changed? And if so, how do we make a transition there? Or are they going to come back in either the same or stronger? So I think as the economy of the United States in particular shifts to recovery, where do you fit in that mix? I think that's what we're going to be watching most closely.
Well, thank you to all three of you for doing this, for joining us today, for offering your insights. Thanks to everybody that joined us. Our next event is on Thursday, November 12th. It's our annual meeting and report to members. Very pleased that Adam Pratt, who many of you know from Shearex Fastening Solutions, is our keynote speaker. Fast-growing company, great story. We're looking forward to hearing from him. We'll also talk about World Trade Center Buffalo Niagara in the past year with our organization, and I will tell you, I can't wait to dig into that speech. That's going to be a fun one. Thank you again, everyone. We hope to see you on the 12th, and appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Thanks for the
Thank you.
invitation.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.